Break Fix's History of Motorsports series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
Few cars have captured the essence of American performance and racing heritage quite like the Ford GT. In his book, Ford GT, How Ford Silenced the Critics, Humbled Ferrari, and Conquered Le Mans, author Preston Lerner takes readers on a thrilling deep dive into history, engineering, and racing legacy of this iconic machine. From the groundbreaking GT40 that stunned the motorsports world in the 1960s to the modern GT's triumphant return to Le Mans in 2016, Preston masterfully weaves together the stories of the visionaries, drivers, and engineers who made it all possible. In this episode, we return to the International Motor Racing Research Center for a center conversation where Preston explores the book's most fascinating insights, discusses Ford's relentless pursuit of victory, and uncovers what makes the GT one of the most legendary race cars of all time.
For those of you who have not had a chance to meet, my name is Tom Liederman. This is one of the most delightful opportunities I get to welcome people to our center conversation. And particularly today with our wonderful speaker, Preston Lerner. Pressure, Preston. I am delighted to have such a wonderful crowd here today to hear this presentation. And let's get right to it. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Preston Lerner and his doggone, let's see, what is that? Oh, it's the GT40. Are you ready, Preston?
I think Don's going first.
Sorry about that, Don. Don Capps is a member of our Historians Council, a great friend of the center, and so now let me bring up Don Capps, who will give you more information. Don.
The center conversations, which have been going on since, 2000, like late 1999, 2000. I've been here associated with this organization for a long time. And to have someone like Preston and some of the other people would come, this is great. Plus, this is a wonderful crowd today. Preston and I have gone back a little ways, back and forth on some things, a couple books. Preston is a contributing writer for Automobile magazine, and has written several really interesting books. Scarab, which is still kind of a milestone for that particular mark. Delves into Paul Newman, Mexico. Also, a really wonderful book on automotive mythology, which I enjoyed that one a great deal because it made a very dear lady in England very happy to see something that she had done a lot of research on. You have to read a book, by the way. But one that's very dear to all of us who are here today is his work on the Ford GT and the Le Mans race of 1966. I don't know how many of you remember back in the dark ages where about 2 or 3 times a year you get a satellite TV beamed in from France on the Le Mans race, and there it was, the American cars coming across the line in the rain. And that was an incredible experience to see it live, all in any color you want as long as it's black and white. So things have changed a great deal. And one of the things that's nice to have someone like Preston here is he brings a tremendous amount of information and knowledge on the automobile world and racing itself. So basically somebody really doesn't need an introduction, but someone who really, I think, was a great pleasure to have here today. Preston Lerner.
Thank you, Don. Thanks also to Tom and Glenda and Josh and Bill and Kip and everybody else here at the International Motor Racing Research Center. This is my first visit. It's a fantastic facility, and it's an honor and a thrill to stand at the spiritual home of American road racing. I am the author of Ford GT, and if you can see from this unconscionably long subtitle, my book is specifically about the Ford factory program to win Le Mans. Ford Advanced Vehicles built 133 or 134 Ford GT40s. Only about 2 dozen of them were raced by the factory. The rest were sold to privateers. Some of them had some amazing successes. The most famous, and a lot of you here probably know it, was Chassis 1075, which went on to win Le Mans 2 years running in 68 and 69. And there were Ford GT40s that continued to race in club races well into the 70s. So there's a lot of history there, but I'm really focused very specifically on the years 63 to 67 when Ford ran a factory program. You know, a lot of stories have been told about the GT40. Several excellent books have been written over the years. There are still some points of dispute. You know, I reach my own conclusions. Your mileage may vary, but this is the story as I see it, at any rate. And I'm happy to answer as many questions as you guys have. The Ford GT saga begins in the early 1960s. Ford's products had become very stodgy, and the company was losing youth sales and market share to General Motors. So at the tail end of '61, Lee Iacocca was brought in to run Ford division, and one of his primary objectives was to appeal to the first cohort of what we now call the baby boom generation. One of the ways he wanted to do that was to implement the win on Sunday, sell on Monday concept. Iacocca was instrumental in inaugurating the Total Performance program, and the idea was to use racing as a marketing tool to appeal especially to younger buyers. So Total Performance ended up, there was a whole bunch of stuff that they did, but the four major components, at least for our purposes, they did drag racing, which was based on the muscle cars that were already coming off the assembly line. They did stock cars with Holman and Moody, and they sent a whole bunch of money down to Charlotte and Motors, especially the 427, big block. They did Indy cars. Winning Indy was their big goal. Created a special motor, a 255 cubic inch twin cam Ford 4K motor, which became one of the great engines in Indy history. And there was road racing with the Cobras, which were really successful here in the States and would go on to be very successful overseas. But, you know, the Cobra was a GT car, and it wasn't really eligible. It was never going to win Le Mans overall. And frankly, no one in the United States, or very few people in the United States, knew anything except for Le Mans. And Ford had nothing in its inventory to go win Le Mans. So at the same time that these things are going on here in the States, Enzo Ferrari in Maranello, he was looking to the future and was worried about what was going to happen. Ferrari was in certain respect the polar opposite of Ford, because Ford used racing to sell street cars. Enzo sold street cars to fund racing. And he could only sell so many cars because there was, you know, a relatively small market for it. And he was wondering how long he was going to be able to fund the racing program to continue to win at endurance racing at Le Mans, and he was also in Formula One in a big way. So Ferrari let it be known through his emissaries that he might be willing to sell the company. Ford got wind of this. They sent over a bunch of accountants and technicians. They inventoried the factory. They looked at the books. They sent over Don Fry, who was Lee Iacocca's right-hand man, to negotiate directly with Enzo Ferrari. And torturous negotiations ensued. They hammered out a purchase price, actually put together a contract, and at the 11th hour, Enzo got cold feet, and he left Don Fry standing at the altar. Conspiracy theorists are convinced that Ferrari never intended to sell to Ford, and that this whole ploy was a charade to convince Fiat to buy the company. And in fact, Fiat did buy the company a couple of years later. As devious as Enzo Ferrari was, I think that's a little more Machiavellian than he truly was. You know, my reading of the subject is that the more the negotiations went on, the clearer it became to Ferrari that if he became part of the Ford corporate empire, he was no longer going to be able to act like an absolute monarch, which is what he's been since he started the company. So he told Don Fry he wasn't interested. Fry goes back to Dearborn. He meets with Henry Ford II. Henry, known as the Deuce, was the grandson of Henry Ford. He was the CEO and president of Ford Motor Company. He'd been running it since World War II, and he was every bit as autocratic as Enzo Ferrari. And so when Fry tells Henry what happened, Ford was convinced that Enzo had essentially given him the middle finger. So he told Fry, well, if that's the way he wants it, you go over there and whip his ass. Or he may have said, you go to Le Mans and beat his ass. It's actually not clear exactly what he said, because Fry told the story different ways to different people. The salient point is that Henry Ford wanted Ford Motor Company to win Le Mans, and he wanted to humiliate Ferrari in the process. So that's what they set out to do. But the problem was Ford didn't actually have anybody in its entire company, which was something like 350,000 employees, who knew anything about international road racing. And the only guy who was sort of knowledgeable on the subject at all was a British transplant by the name of Roy Lunn. And Lunn had run the Aston Martin program that went to Le Mans in '49. That actually sounds a little more impressive than it is, because back then the Astons were essentially modified street cars. And after that, Lunn had nothing to do with racing. He worked on the production side of the business for Jowett and then for Ford of England. Then he came over to the States and he worked in R&D at Ford. But in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Roy Lunn was tasked with putting together a proposal that would be presented to the Ford management to sort of greenlight this program. Lunn was a clever guy, a clever engineer, and he realized that what Ford needed was going to be a mid-engine monocoque with a swoopy aerodynamic body powered by a Ford V8. He also roughed out the dimensions of the car, which he called the GT40 because it was supposed to be 40 inches high. So Lunn and Don Fry go to Ford management. They present this plan. Ford management says, great, go win Le Mans. They didn't think it was really going to be that big a deal. You know, Lunn was the one who really understood the enormity of the project that Ford had ahead of it. So the problem was there was nobody at Ford who knew how to build a car like this. And in fact, there was no one in the United States who really had any experience with mid-engine monocoque chassis. So Roy Lunn decided to go to England to find somebody to design and build the car that would go to Le Mans. And they considered a couple of possibilities before deciding on Eric Broadley. Broadly had been working in the construction trades in the mid-50s when he built a special to go road racing at the club level himself. And his car was so successful against the Lotuses that other guys commissioned cars from him. And eventually he was successful enough that he created a company called Lola Cars. And in '63 he had wowed the motorsports world with a car called the Lola Mark VI, or sometimes the Lola GT. And this was a mid-engine monocoque with swoopy aerodynamic bodywork powered by a Ford V8 engine, which is to say it was exactly what Roy Lunn was looking for. Broadly is hired. The company leases shop space near Heathrow Airport, forms a company called Ford Advanced Vehicles to build the cars. Broadly brings his small Lola crew over. John Wyer, who had become famous for ramrodding the Aston Martin team that won Le Mans in '59, was brought in to run the operation, sort of keep the trains running on time. John Wyer was nicknamed Death Ray. You can sort of get the sense why from the way he looks here. He wasn't a good guy to have mad at you. And then Roy Lunn came over to England with 3 Ford engineers, and they went to work. Now, one of the pervasive myths that really kind of annoy me is that people say that the Ford GT was nothing more than a warmed-over Lola, and that's demonstrably false, denied explicitly by Broadley and Wyer and Lunn. The engine was entirely an American product, obviously. It was essentially the 255 cubic inch IndyCar motor with a pushrod valve train instead of a twin cam arrangement. The body, which you saw before, actually had been, a full-size clay had been done before Broadley was hired. Lunn had already sketched out the dimensions before Broadley was hired. The monocoque had a lot of Lola stuff in it, no question about it, but it was bigger and more robust, and frankly the Brits were aghast at how heavy it was. The suspension was pretty much standard race car practice of the day, but the suspension geometry was put together by a Ford engineer back in Dearborn who was using software written in Fortran on an IBM mainframe. Not sure how well that worked. So it was really an Anglo-American collaboration in the truest sense of the word, and I think that's the best way to think of it. The collaboration didn't go all that smoothly, to be honest. There was a serious culture clash, and it wasn't so much between Americans and the English, but it was the Ford guys were formerly trained engineers who were used to working in a corporate environment. You know, they were accustomed to protocols and design reviews and all sorts of formalized procedures to follow. And the Brits were racers. It wasn't that they, were shade tree mechanics, but they were used to doing things on the fly and making corrections as necessary. The two groups did not get along at all. The Americans thought the Brits were kind of bumpkins, and the Brits thought the Americans were stick-in-the-muds. So before too long, Roy Lunn and Eric Broadley, who were the two people in charge of the program, weren't even talking to each other. And everything had to go through Roy Lunn, and that didn't work too well. Originally, they had hoped to race at the beginning of the '64 season, and in fact, the first car wasn't finished until April '64. And it was shown briefly here at Heathrow Airport, and that's actually Wyer on the left, Broadley in the middle, and a rare picture of Roy Lunn on the right. And then it was flown over to the States, where it was shown very briefly to the American media right before the New York Auto Show. And then this car, which is the first car, was sent over to Le Mans for the Le Mans test. And there was a second car finished so late that it was shipped over to France without even being graphicked up properly. So needless to say, the cars hadn't been tested really at all. They'd just been shaken down to make sure they would run. They get to Le Mans, and it's a disaster. These are cars that are supposed to go 200 miles an hour, and at 150 miles an hour, they were all over the road. Joe Schlescher, a French driver who was brought in because Bruce McLaren wasn't available, goes out in the first car and immediately totals it at the Mulsanne kink. The second car is driven by Roy Salvadori, who had won Le Mans with Carroll Shelby in '59, and he's cajoled by a Wyer to get back into the car on the second day, and he does so against his better judgment and proceeds to crash the car at Mulsanne hairpin, prangs the front end, and so that car is done for the day. Salvadori was so unimpressed by the car that he immediately quit the program in the interest of his self-preservation, as he put it. In fact, though, that was the wrong call on Salvadori's part. The problem with the car was that the aerodynamics of the bodywork produced a bunch of rear-end lift, which is exactly what you don't want in a race car. Simply by slapping a spoiler on the rear deck, that settled down the rear end, and thereafter, pretty much everybody who drove the Ford GT said it was among their favorite cars ever. It was a big car. It was a heavy car. It was not good in the slow stuff. It wasn't agile, but it was extremely stable and benign in medium speed and high speed corners. It was faster than any Indy car or Formula One car in a straight line. Ford had spent a lot of time on the cockpit making it comfortable, which was very unusual in those days. Ferrari didn't care about his drivers. So it was really good for long distance races, and it had the one quality that drivers want most in a race car, and that is that it was fast. It could win races, and so drivers generally loved the GT40, the guys who drove it, except for Roy Salvadori, of course. So a month after the two cars are wrecked at Le Mans, there's a car, I believe this is the second car that was repaired, and it goes to the Nürburgring for its race debut. Nürburgring really was the wrong spot for a debut, but it was their only chance to race the car before Le Mans, so that's where Ford decided to go. Phil Hill and McLaren are in the car. They qualify second to John Surtees in the lead Ferrari. They run second in the race, but then they break predictably pretty early on. For Le Mans, then it's a month later, so they had 3 cars at Le Mans, which is pretty impressive for a brand new operation. End of the first lap, Ferraris were leading 1, 2, 3. They go down to Tertre Rouge, which is the right-hander leads onto the Mulsanne straight to start lap 2. Ferraris 1, 2, 3. The 4th car in line is Richie Ginther, and he's behind them, and at the end of the Mulsanne straight, he is past all 3 Ferraris and he's disappearing into the distance. Ginther leads easily for the first hour. He pits, Maston Gregory gets in the car, Maston Gregory leads easily during his stint. The car is the fastest car on the track, but unfortunately it breaks. Second car catches on fire, so its race is over. Third car is Phil Hill and Bruce McLaren, and they're delayed at the start. They have a misfire that takes them a while to figure out. But once the car is going, it's also the fastest car on the track. Sets the track record, but then it fails slightly before half distance. All 3 cars failed, which is not what you want when you go racing. But reliability is something that you can deal with. At least the cars were fast. That's what you want with a new car. You want it to be fast. You can always work on fragility later on. Generally speaking, the Ford camp was upbeat after that first Le Mans. The rest of the year didn't go quite as well. They raced at Rennes in France shortly after Le Mans, and the cars performed very badly. So thereafter, Wire decided not to do any more racing, and he wanted to focus on testing and development. But towards the end of the year, he was ordered actually, to prep 2 cars for the Nassau Speed Weeks. And he didn't want to go there. These were races in the Bahamas. They were a run what you brung deal. It was on a tight circuit. He thought it was a waste of time to go, but he was, as I say, coerced into sending 2 cars there. And the problem is they do terribly. Here they're being outrun by a Cobra of all things. Both of the Ford GTs break, and they're beaten by GM products, which sort of adds insult to injury. After Nassau, there's a big powwow back in Dearborn, and the Ford discusses what went wrong with the season, and they decided that the problem with the Ford GT program was not the cars, it was John Wire. So they fired John Wire, although they let him continue to run the customer racing program. And they decided to have the racing program run by their in-house snake charmer, Carroll Shelby. Don't think Shelby needs much of an introduction here. One of the most charismatic figures ever, great driver. He created the Cobras. What's important is he'd also put together a race team called Shelby American, based in Southern California. And I know today it sounds weird to think of a racing team in Los Angeles because everybody's in Charlotte or they're in Indianapolis or somewhere near a racetrack. But Southern California had been the really center of American racing industry pretty much since Harry Miller opened his shop in downtown Los Angeles in the teens. And well into the 50s, most of the really competitive Indy Roadsters and sprint cars and midgets were still coming out of shops in Los Angeles. In addition to all the sort of racing history, Southern California was the birthplace of hot rod civilization. So there was a tremendous talent pool of really good craftsmen, experienced race mechanics there for Shelby to choose from. And Southern California was also where all the aerospace stuff was happening. In addition to the people, Shelby had access to a bunch of materials and components and technologies that were just then finding their way into the motorsports world. I mean, stuff like titanium and AN fittings and stuff we really all take for granted now. I mean, that was just then moving over into that world. So Shelby put together a really impressive organization. I don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about all the people who went on to bigger and better things, but 2 of them deserve special mention. First, Phil Remington, master of all trades. Remington could do pretty much anything. He was a machinist, he could weld, he could fabricate, he could tune suspensions, breathe on motors. I mean, he could do it all. The thing about him that made him difficult to work with was not that he was difficult personally. He was actually a very pleasant guy and extremely humble considering how accomplished he was. But as I said about him, he could do everything that you could do, and he could do it faster, and he could do it for longer than you could do it. But Carroll Smith, who was the race engineer, you guys have probably seen his Tune to Win and Fasteners to Win, all those books. He said that Remington's greatest skill was that he was a problem solver, and he would come up with fixes before other people even realized that there was a problem. So Remington's number 1, and I think he was probably the single most important person in the Ford GT program. Second was Ken Miles. I was a Brit. He'd driven a tank after D-Day in World War II, come over to California in the 50s to work at an MG dealership, was a champion small bore racer in West Coast racing, was hired by Shelby for the Cobra program, won a whole bunch of races in Cobras. Besides being a really talented race car driver, he was a test driver par excellence, and he could drive for hours on end at 9/10 without damaging the car and then come back and tell people exactly what the car was doing in the middle of turn 6, at 4,200 RPM or whatever it was. So he was an invaluable resource. The cars come over from England in December of 1964, and they are immediately Shelbyized. First thing they do is they paint them blue, is a Shelby blue. Next thing they did, these are the brawny wheels. Wire wheels were replaced by good old American Hallobrand mags. The 255 IndyCar motor is replaced by a 289 small block, which had been proven in the Cobras already. They started testing the things, mostly at Riverside. This happens to be at Willow Springs, which is north of LA. Miles and Bondurant would bomb around the track for hours on end. They'd report all their issues to Remington. Remington would make the fixes, implement them. They'd go back out to Riverside and Willow Springs and repeat as necessary. They only had about 6 weeks before Daytona, but they sent 2 cars to Daytona, and lo and behold, Miles and Lloyd Ruby win in their first outing for Shelby American. So as you can imagine, the Ford guys thought that Shelby walked on water after that. It was not only the first win for the Ford GT, it was the first time the car had ever come close to finishing a race. Unfortunately, I think the British expression is that it flattered to deceive, because this turned out to be the high point of the 65 season. The rest of the year went pretty disastrously. They were beaten everywhere, and they were humiliated a couple of places. Ford realized that it needed to sort of do something to raise its game, so to speak. So one of the steps they took was to create an in-house subsidiary called CarCraft. And this was a quasi-works, skunk works, where Ford engineers were sent either on the payroll or to moonlight and come up with R&D improvements to advance the program. And one of the things they decided to do was to use the 427 cubic inch motor, the big block, which was being raced really successfully in NASCAR by Holman and Moody. And so the guys at CarCraft thought it might be a good idea to see if they could stick a 427 into Ford GT. And it really wasn't a particularly difficult conversion. They had to cut a rear bulkhead, they had to move the seats, a bunch of plumbing changes. Later on, they developed a new transmission. But by and large, it was a pretty simple conversion by industry standards. And when they finished the car, Ken Miles was dispatched to Michigan to the Romeo test track to see what the car would do. And after shaking it down, he goes out and he pretty immediately gets the car up to 201.5 miles an hour. And when he gets out of the car, Roy London says to him, "What do you think?" And Miles says, "That's the car I want to race at Le Mans." Which is good, except that there was only about 6 weeks to go before Le Mans. It was now a rush program to get the car prepared. The new car, the big block car, is dubbed the Mark II, and the small block cars are retroactively named Mark Is, just for future reference. So, for Le Mans, Ford shows up with 6 cars. They got 2 Mark IIs, brand new, 4 Mark Is. The Mark IIs had barely been shaken down before the race. And when they got to the track, they found out they were wicked loose. And that's really a problem in Le Mans, which was one of the fastest tracks in the world. So during the course of practice and qualifying, the Shelby American guys spent most of their time behind the pits, cutting aluminum, shaping it, and then affixing these appendages to the race car. The car was completely clean aerodynamically when it showed up at Le Mans. Here it's got a front air dam, it's got a canards on the front fender, it's got these weird-looking tail fins on the rear deck, and it's also got a big rear spoiler, which you can't see. So the car looked kind of like a Frankensteinish, ran like a monster out on the track. And as soon as the race starts, that's Bruce McLaren in the lead, Chris Amon behind him. When they get to the end of the Mulsanne straight at lap 1, they can barely see the Ferraris in their rearview mirrors. These guys dominate the race in the Mark IIs until they break. This is kind of a common theme with the Ford story. It turns out the problems were really kind of fluky deals that didn't have anything to do with the new motor, but nevertheless the cars broke. And to make matters worse, so did all 4 of the Mark Is. Ford was 0 for 6, which is a pretty bad 0 for. Back in Dearborn, there was serious consternation and wonderment about why things had gone so badly wrong. So Ford created a thing called the Le Mans Committee. And I know that sounds like bureaucratic sort of ass covering, sort of like a blue ribbon committee. But in fact, the department heads from each of the major departments at Ford were put onto this committee. So they had a representative from engine and foundry and transmissions and design and even public relations. And they would meet periodically to check on what was going on and to chart course corrections if necessary. One thing they really need to understand is what sort of resources that Ford put into this program. And it wasn't just money, even though what Ford spent was unprecedented. No one had ever come close to spending this kind of money. But this was the first time that a major mainstream manufacturer had ever gone racing in a big-time way. Ford was creating a paradigm for what would be used in decades to come. It's still being used to this day. And in addition to the money that they spent, they had all these R&D resources that teams like Ferrari or Jaguar, had no access to. They created CarCraft, a whole subsidiary for racing. There was an engine cell, a dyno cell, where they would run 427s for 24 to 48 hours. Not just the motors, but they had it attached to a gearbox, which was run by servos so that it could mimic all the gear changes made at Le Mans. That was something that no one else had ever thought of doing before, and I don't even know who does that to this day. It was a really impressive effort. I just think that's worth remembering as an overarching theme in this project. Anyway, Le Mans Committee, they came up with a couple of important decisions. First, they decided to bag the rest of the 65 season. Their thinking was that nobody cared about places like Spa and Monza, if they even heard of them here in the States. All really Ford cared about was winning Le Mans and maybe to a lesser degree the American races at Sebring and Daytona. So they decided to forget about racing anymore in 65 and focus on testing and development here in the States. And the testing was relentless. Again, no test program like this had ever been seen before. Not only would Shelby Americans show up with all their guys, but Ford would send a bunch of engineers, and they also had the vendors show up with engineers, so Lockheed or Girling or Goodyear. And everybody would then write up reports, these memos, and all these memos would be sent around to everybody, and it's just stacks and stacks of paper, which are really kind of fascinating to see what they found, all the different things they experimented with and just tried to make work. The third thing they decided to do was not leave all their eggs in the Carroll Shelby basket. And so it was decided to bring in Holman and Moody, which had been the dominant force down in stock car racing, to also be involved in the program. They also brought in Alan Mann over in England, and Mann had just won the GT championship with the Cobra Daytona Coupe, so he was brought in as well. Although, to be honest, he was always a minor player. And the other thing that the Le Mans Committee decided to do was to double down on the big block motor. And this was a controversial decision at the time, and there's still debate about it to this day. The Brits were convinced that Ford could win Le Mans with the small block engine. And I guess you could argue that they did win Le Mans with the small block in 68 and 69. But that, of course, was after the unlimited engines had been outlawed. Still, you can make the case that maybe the 289 would have beaten Ferrari at Le Mans in 66. But there's an axiom in boxing that a good big man will always beat a good small man. And I think that's the case with the engines. No way the small block was going to beat a big block car. The big block was too powerful, too much torque, which the drivers love because that's what you want coming out of a corner. And since it was so strong, they could basically lope along at 6,000 or 6,200 RPM and still go 200 miles an hour. Yes, it was heavier, so it was harder on brakes and tires and all sorts of components, but on balance, I think the 427 was the way to go. So they test for the rest of the 65 season, start the 66 season, go to Daytona, it's a 1-2-3 finish, Ruby and Miles repeating their victory of 65. Next race at Sebring, 1-2 finish. This is Miles and Ruby again, now in the open top X1. Should have been a 1-2-3 finish. This is the famous race, or the infamous race, where Dan Gurney was leading. His car broke on the last corner of the last lap, and he was disqualified for pushing the car across the start line. So the teams go to Le Mans, loaded for bear. They're the prohibitive favorites. They have no fewer than 8 cars. It's like an armada no one's ever seen before. 3 Shelby American cars, 3 Holman and Moody cars, 2 Alan Mann cars. They're the prohibitive favorites going into the race. But, being favorites also, there's pressure by being kind of the odds-on favorite. And the person who was feeling it more than anybody was Leo Beebe. Leo Beebe was the guy in charge of all of Ford Racing's programs. And he had been a confidant of Henry Ford II since they met in the Navy during World War II. But before Le Mans, Henry Ford had met with Beebe, and he'd handed him a note card on which he'd handwritten 3 words, "You better win." Beebe understood this wasn't like a friendly exhortation. This was an order from his commander-in-chief, and he was going to be expected to fall on his sword if he failed to win Le Mans. This little card meant so much to Beebe that he carried it in his wallet for the rest of his life. So, yeah, he kind of knew you better win. Before the race starts, Ford meets with all its drivers, and they give everybody strict orders to run to very conservative lap times, so they'll finish the race. And so far as I can tell, nobody paid any attention to these lap times. The first lap, this was still when they had the Le Mans start. When they ran across the track and jumped in his car, Miles' door didn't close properly. So he has to pit at the end of the first lap, and he goes out and immediately sets a lap record to make up for lost time. Meanwhile, Dan Gurney never likes to be slower than anybody in the Ford team, so he sets another lap record while taking the lead. The third Shelby American car was driven by Chris Amon and Bruce McLaren. Team McLaren, was sort of McLaren's fledgling manufacturing operation, was sponsored by Firestone. Everybody else was running Goodyears. During this race, as you can sort of see here, it rained on and off, the track was greasy, called for intermediate tires. It just so happened the Firestone intermediate was junk. Kept throwing treads, so they lost several laps replacing tires. And finally, McLaren makes the politically inexpedient decision to get rid of his Firestones, even though Firestone is his sponsor, and slap on a set of Goodyears. And this is when he leans down into the car and tells Amon, well, what Amon told me, he said, was drive the door handles off the door. I believe what Amon told A.J. Bain was go like hell. Whatever, the point was they wanted to run flat out to make up for lost time. And that's what they did. By about halfway through the race, it's Shelby American cars 1, 2, 3. Ferraris are nowhere. It's Ford's race to win. But then, shortly after dawn, Jerry Grant pits from the lead in the car he's sharing with Dan Gurney. The water temp gauge is pegged. Head gasket's gone. Leo Beebe feels a sinking sensation in his stomach. Remember, Beebe's been through 64, where all 3 cars have failed. He's been through 65, when all 6 cars have failed. At this point, there are 4 GTs left, so 4 of them are already gone. And all he can think of is that he's got this "you better win" note card in his pocket, and he's got Henry Ford II with his vast entourage looking over his shoulder, and he doesn't want to screw things up. So he immediately sends down orders to slow the cars down to lap times of 4 minutes a lap. They had qualified around 3:30 a lap. So this is 30 seconds off the pace. Granted, it was greasy on the track, and it's an endurance race. Those are lap times that an amateur could be driving at. And Chris Amon told me that it took him about 15 to 20 minutes just to slow down to that pace. Thereafter, the race ceases to be a race in any sort of what we think of a race. I mean, there was no real competition out there. If you look at the results, and you'll see that the lead changed hands numerous times over the course of the last 8 hours between the Amon McLaren car, and they're in the black car, and the Miles Denny Hume car, which is the second car over there in line. But it wasn't because they were dicing for the lead. It was because, their pit stop schedules, they just pitted at different times, and they had to pit about every hour for gas. They needed tires periodically. These cars went through brake pads, so they had to make pad changes. Both of them changed rotors before the race was over. They weren't really competing. All they were doing was clicking off laps and making their way to the finish. Somewhere along the line, someone comes up with the bright idea of staging a dead heat finish. Now, this is, to me, one of the great mysteries of Le Mans 66, and there's a bunch of mysteries about this race. I have no idea who really came up with the idea. Bruce McLaren said he did, but that seems really unlikely to me. And the thing is, I cannot think of a single automobile race that's ever ended in a dead heat, not a major one. I can't think of a single race of any kind that ended in a dead heat, whether it be a horse race or a boat race or a political race. The whole point of racing is to anoint a winner. So I don't know why anyone thought they were going to be able to do this. But to Leo Beebe, this sounded like a great idea. First of all, it would be a public relations coup for Ford. Second of all, it would prevent the first two cars from fighting with each other for the win. And that was his great fear, was that they would start dicing and they would crash into each other and things would go down the tubes. So Ford official is sent over to talk to the ACO, which is the Automobile Club of the West, which is the idiosyncratic organization that runs Le Mans. And the French officials essentially say, we're cool with that. If you want a dead heat finish, go for it. So Ford official comes back. He reports to Beebe and Shelby and all the Ford guys, we can do a dead heat finish if you want to do it. Somewhere along the line, the Ken Miles car had pulled well ahead of the McLaren Amon car. And why it did so is also a subject of dispute. Miles fans and Charlie Agapiu, who was his crew chief and is still around to this day, are convinced it was because Miles was the faster driver in the faster car. Bruce McLaren always contended that Miles had flouted team orders, and instead of running at 4 minutes a lap, he cut a couple of quick laps to make sure that he was in the lead when they came down to the end of the race. At this point, it's impossible to say what really happened, but the point was, before they were to get into their cars for their final stint, both McLaren and Miles were brought over to talk to the Ford Brain Trust, and they were told, Miles, you slow down, let McLaren catch up to you. By this time, there's only one other Ford left, and that was a Holman and Moody car being driven by Dick Hutcherson, who was a stock car ace who admitted later he had no business driving at Le Mans. He was completely out of his element. I mean, you can imagine also in the rain and at night, he never even turned right before. He's in third place, but he's 10 laps down. So Miles and McLaren get in their cars for their final stint, and they start circling around. Miles slows down, McLaren starts to catch up. Meanwhile, the Ford official comes running breathlessly into the Ford pits, and he says, the ACO has changed its mind. They're no longer going to allow a dead heat finish. If the cars finish side by side, the car that has covered the greatest distance will be declared the winner. Now, it just so happened that Miles and Hume qualified second, Amon and McLaren qualified fourth. So therefore, Amon and McLaren will have covered about 20 more feet than the other car, and it would be declared the winner on that basis. Problem is, there are no in-car radios back in 1966. The only way to communicate with the drivers is via pit boards, which was shown at the Mulsanne hairpin. And it's pretty hard to get this whole thing in writing, I think, while the drivers are going by. Theoretically, they could have pitted the cars to tell the drivers what was going on, but no one wanted to take the chance, I think, of an unscheduled pit stop for no particularly good reason. And also, from Leo Beebe's perspective, all that could happen was bad things if the guys understood the situation, because Miles might be encouraged to start racing with McLaren for the win. And that's exactly what he didn't want to happen. Again, there are a lot of people who think that Beebe purposely screwed Miles out of the win, and I find this a little difficult to believe. I mean, Miles was a little difficult personally, and I guess you could argue that he had flouted team orders earlier in the race, if he did flout team orders earlier in the race. But, he'd been a stalwart of the program. He'd done most of the testing and development. He knew the Ford guys really well. He was coming off wins at Daytona and Sebring. I mean, I don't see any reason why they would have wanted to hang him out to dry. I think Beebe's issue was he didn't want anything to go wrong. And he didn't particularly care who won the race as long as a Ford won the race. And from his perspective, it was safer to do nothing. So he did nothing. And the cars continued on to the finish. And this is the famous finish. In this photo, as you can see, this is McLaren leading. with Miles lagging back. And so there are schools of thought that say that McLaren goosed the throttle to steal the victory. And some people claim that Miles purposely held back to show his disgruntlement at Ford for denying him the victory. In fact, Miles says that the real finish line is actually back about 10 yards from there. And he said when they crossed the timing line, there was actually a wire, that they were as close to being dead even as they could. And nobody knew what was going on in the pits. I mean, even in the Ford camp, they weren't exactly sure what was going to happen. There's a fellow here, Bill Benet, who was actually there in '66, who was actually there while this was going on. Nobody in the stands knew what was going on. Chris Amon in the pits didn't know what was going on. He didn't realize that he was the winner until they started pushing him toward the victory rostrum. On the other hand, Ken Miles thought he had won the race, and he actually tried to drive his car to the victory rostrum, and he didn't realize that he was second until they wouldn't let him go there. So, and Ford couldn't have cared less either way. I mean, to the United States, no one had heard of any of these guys. I mean, you had a transplanted Brit and 3 guys from New Zealand. All the people in the United States knew that a Ford had won, finished 1, 2, 3, vanquished Ferrari, mission accomplished. Which is why Henry Ford is the only guy who looks really, really happy here on the victory rostrum. That's Amon and McLaren, and to me their smiles look a little bit sheepish. A couple of minutes after that, Miles and Hume are more or less pushed onto the rostrum, and there's a pretty telling photo of Miles who looks like he's gritting his teeth while he's grinning, clearly not happy to be there. The only person who looks really elated is Henry Ford, and that's important to note because a week before the race, Henry Ford had told reporters he figured this would be the end of the program after Le Mans. And when you think about it, this was the perfect place to end the program. They just finished 1, 2, 3, beaten Ferrari, done everything they'd set out to do. All that could happen from now was things could go downhill. The thing is, though, racing is a brutal, cruel sport. So many things go wrong so many times that when you win any race, I mean, even at the lowliest club level, you're just so happy, at least I'm so happy, so you're just elated. And you can see Ford here, he's just jazzed by the whole thing. And he's so amped that when they ask him, well, what are you guys going to do now? He says, we're going to come back and do it again. And I think this came as a surprise to all the people at Ford. I don't think anyone really intended to, really figured there was going to be a 1967 program. So a lot of people, sort of the Ford saga ends here. But I actually like the rest of the story, which is just one more year. Because to me, it's the best part of the story, even though it's sort of a postscript in some respects. After Le Mans, Alan Mann is let go. Holman and Moody plays a larger role in testing and development, and they incorporate a lot of NASCAR technology into the race car. Most notably, there was a heavy-duty roll cage, and this turns out to be a big deal, at least to Peter Revson, because it's thought to have saved his life when he barrel-rolled his car during testing at Daytona. And there's, again, they test and test and test and test, and they do so much testing that they rename the cars as Mark IIBs. The 66 cars were called Mark IIAs. But at any rate, Ford goes to Daytona to begin the 67 season, and they figure they're going to have more of the same, going to beat Ferrari again, going to be a nice, easy year. Instead, they run into a buzzsaw, and it's called the Ferrari 330 P4. A gorgeous car. It's a car that sounds spectacular. It's agile. It's fast. It's as iconic in its own way, the P4 is, as the Mark II was. At Daytona, Ford has a catastrophic race. Output shafts for the transmissions were improperly heat-treated, and every one of them fails. Only one car finished the race, and it was way back. The Ferraris finished 1, 2, 3, and they managed the picture-perfect line-abreast formation, at the finish that Ford kind of botched there at Le Mans. To add sort of insult to injury, after the race, Chris Amon, who had moved over to the Ferrari team, said the Ford handled like a truck compared to the Ferrari. So the Ford guys weren't too happy. But besides being humiliated, there's also a sense of, well, what do we do now? They just spent 6 months developing, this Mark IIB, and it had just been trounced by Ferrari at Daytona. And it's conceivable that the Mark II might have been able to beat Ferrari at Le Mans, which was a track that favored the Fords, but it definitely wasn't a done deal. So Phil Remington came up with a plan B, or sort of a plan J, as you might want to call it. And I got to backtrack really briefly to why that is. So from the very beginning of the program, everyone understood excessive weight was the biggest issue with the Ford GTs. And there have been all sorts of efforts to lighten the cars. They used aluminum bodywork and actually an aluminum chassis. They cut the tops off. But eventually a Ford engineer by the name of Chuck Mountain, who had been one of the guys who had gone over to England in '63 to work on the original car, found a company in western Massachusetts called Brunswick. And it made a bunch of consumer products, and one of them was actually bowling pins, believe it or not. I think it was those AMF bowling pins. But they also were a major Department of Defense contractor, and they were building instrument panels for fighter jets out of a aluminum honeycomb material that was very light yet very rigid. So Mountain thought it might be possible to build a monocoque out of this material. Ed Hull, who was one of the unsung heroes of the program, built a chassis where he used honeycomb aluminum. It was bonded with an industrial-grade glue that was cured in a high-temperature ovens, very similar to the autoclaves used now to make carbon fiber. And around this monocoque, Ford Styling put together a radical-looking bodywork. It had these protrusions at the front that looked to me like lobster claws. and it had this high, long rear deck, which has actually been modified here a little bit already, but it resembled a bread van. They dubbed this the J car. And the J car actually was slightly faster than the Mark II, but only slightly. And most of the drivers, well, actually all the drivers except for Eamon, preferred the Mark II. So it was decided to race the Mark II in '66 at Le Mans. And that was the right call, obviously. They finished 1, 2, 3. But they continued to test the J car after Le Mans. And so Ken Miles was in the car at Riverside in August. They're testing 2 experimental semi-automatic transmissions. And on the back straight, while he was doing something like a $180 or something like that, car goes out of control. No one to this day knows exactly why. All sorts of theories. Some people say they thought the bodywork was aerodynamically unstable. I find it hard to believe. Some people thought the honeycomb aluminum actually came apart in the monocoque. Some people think the brakes locked. I think the most likely thing was that the transmission froze in gear. Anyway, the car goes off the track, high speed, barrel rolls, Miles is ejected, and he's killed on the spot. And that's probably the lowest day in the history of the Ford GT program. And that also ends, as you might imagine, development of the J car. Until Daytona 1967, when Ford has nothing else in its cupboard to beat Ferrari. So Phil Remington comes up with the idea of using the J car. He thought it was a good chassis, and he thought the problem was the bodywork, which he suspected was very draggy, is the way he put it. So Remington flies to Dearborn with 2 of his top fabricators, and they take the car into the wind tunnel. And Remington literally starts hacking away at the bodywork and reshaping it totally by intuition into the shape that he thinks will work well. He gets finished. They run the car through the tunnel. The numbers look good. They immediately ship the car out to Kingman, Arizona, a high-speed test track that Ford has out there. Straight out of the box, the Mark IV is 5 miles an hour faster than the Mark II. So Ford decides, hey, I think we got something here. They named the car the Mark IV. And the reason why they didn't name it the Mark III was because the Mark III was the name reserved for, there was a streetcar version of the GT40, of which they built, I think, 7 total. Ford decided to have a kind of gong show bake-off between the Mark IV and the Mark II at Sebring. A whole new Mark IV is built up. The Shelby American was running with Mario Andretti and Bruce McLaren. Holman and Moody was running one of the Mark IIBs. McLaren puts this car on the pole and then races with the Chaparral. They dice for a couple hours until the Chaparral breaks, and the Mark IV wins easily. The Mark II is literally miles and miles behind. This is one of the rare occasions where a car straight out of the box wins its first major race anyway. And the Mark IV actually only raced 2 races, and it won both of them, so it had a pretty good winning record. After Sebring, Ford decides to build 4 brand new Mark IVs. I mean, the resources they had at their disposal were pretty incredible. This is the Gurney Ford car, the really famous one, which is still owned by Ford, the only one that they still own. And Ford goes to Le Mans with 4 Mark IVs with 2 Mark IIs as backup. McLaren puts one of the Mark IVs on the pole, but the Ferrari and Chaparral are right there. And clearly this isn't going to be a cakewalk this year. First of all, remember, Ferrari had crushed the Fords at Daytona, and they'd been faster than the Mark IV in the Le Mans test. Chaparral was the most sophisticated race car in the world in 1967. This was the 2F, the high wing car with the adjustable wing and the semi-automatic transmission. So, Ford had a real race on its hands. It wasn't like '66 where they were just waiting for the Ferraris to fail. McLaren's on the pole, the Chaparral and Ferrari's right there. The slowest Mark IV, strangely enough, is Dan Gurney. Since then, there's sort of this mythology that has grown up that Gurney was sandbagging because he didn't want to embarrass his co-driver, A.J. Foyt. Gurney denies that this was the case. Foyt was not a very experienced road racer, but he was A.J. Foyt. I mean, he was going to go fast, and he did go fast. What happened was that Gurney was consciously following the example of his friend Briggs Cunningham. And Briggs was not a very fast driver, but he always finished at Le Mans, whereas Gurney had DNF'd in 7 out of his 9 races there. So Gurney decided that he was going to go slow, and he was going to especially go slow in the brake zone for the Mulsanne hairpin. What would happen was the cars were going 215 miles an hour down the straight, then they had to brake down to about 35 miles an hour for the hairpin. And you can imagine how hard that was on brake pads. Also, the brakes would get extremely cool on the Mulsanne straight, and when you hammered the brakes, the rotors had a tendency to crack. So what Gurney decided to do was, instead of braking at the 300-yard marker, or whatever it was he decided he could late brake at, he was backing out of the throttle around 600 yards out, letting the aerodynamic drag slow the car down to about 160 miles an hour. Then he was lightly getting into the brake pedal, slowly build up temp so that he would preserve pads and save the rotors. The other reason why he wasn't particularly fast during practice was he was adamant about making the car handle well through the Mulsanne kink. The cars were dead flat through the kink, even at 250 miles an hour. But when the car wasn't handling well, it was a bit of a handful. You really had to concentrate. You had to use all the road. And that was a problem if it was, when it's dark, it might start raining. There was always traffic at Le Mans. Gurney wanted to make sure he could get through the kink literally with one hand on the steering wheel. So he worked for a long time in practice, fiddling with the suspension and adjusting the rear spoiler until he transformed the car into what he described the handling as being like a big American luxury car. It was perfectly stable and really comfortable and just gobbled up miles. That's how he was ready to go. And the race begins. Ronnie Bucknam takes the lead strangely enough, in one of the Mark II Vs, and he holds the lead for the first hour. But Gurney was behind him, and he thought that Ronnie was driving pretty hard to stay there. Gurney takes the lead after the first hour, and he and Foyt lead for the next 23 hours. At one point, they were 8 laps ahead of the lead, and all the other Fords run into trouble. Mario Andretti famously crashes in the S's. Both of the Mark IIs get caught up in his crash, so there are 3 Fords wrecked in like literally 1 minute. Lloyd Ruby beaches his Mark IV in the sand. McLaren loses the bodywork on his Mark IV while he's on the Mulsanne straight. Then he has to go back around, he has to go back out to find it, loses a whole bunch of time, and he finished way back. So while these guys are in the lead, the Ferraris are the best of the rest. And the Ferraris were really good, but they weren't fast enough to catch Foyt and Gurney. So Ferrari realized their only hope of winning the race was to break the Ford. Mike Parks in the P4 was sent out to harry Gurney into driving faster than he wanted or ought to drive. Parks got behind him, and he started juking back and forth and flashing his brights, and then he would outbrake him in the brake zone at the Mulsanne hairpin and down near Arnage, generally behaving like what Gurney called a pain in the ass. Gurney got tired of this, and after a couple of laps, when he got to Arnage, which is the slow right-hander on the backside of the circuit, he pulled off the circuit, and he parked the car, and he just sat there in a neutral with the engine running. And Parks pulls off behind him, and the 2 cars are sitting there. And to me, I think this is the most surreal moment in the history of automobile racing. It's the middle of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the cars running 1-2 are sitting on the side of the road like Uber drivers waiting for their fares to show up. So I love that. But Gurney was content to sit there as long as Parks wanted to sit there. So after about 10 or 15 seconds, Parks finally takes off. Gurney takes off after them, and the race proceeds to the finish. They didn't run very hard thereafter. They didn't have to. They won by, I think, 4 laps, set a new record. Foyt took the last stint. That picture at the beginning was, if you recall, there was Gurney sitting on the hood as they went to the victory rostrum. And here they are at the rostrum, where Gurney famously shakes up his magnum of champagne, pops the cork, and sprays the crowd. Supposedly, this is the first time anyone had ever done this before, and this started a tradition that, for better or worse, exists to this day. This was the capstone of the Ford factory effort. About a week after this, Don Fry announced that Ford was getting out of Le Mans racing. Ford had actually prepared, they had plans for the 68 season, but they shelved them. They didn't want to spend any more money. What more could they do? Shortly thereafter, the CSI, which as I recall was the predecessor of the FIA, or somehow, I don't know the exact relationship, I'm sure Don knows, they changed the regulations and they outlawed unlimited sized engines. They did make a little bit of a mistake there. They created Group 4, where they set the engine limit at 5 liters, and they said the cars had to be homologated. Well, as it turns out, the GT40s, of which there were more than 100 out there, it's easy to homologate it, and it ran a small block 5-liter motor, 289s and also 302s. So John Wyer took GT40s and he got himself some Gulf sponsorship, and he went to Le Mans and won in 68 and 69 with small block GT40s. So Ford wins Le Mans 4 years running. This is the greatest American achievement, I believe, in international road racing. Most of the Ford people, and I suspect most people generally, think the 66 is the best victory. Personally, I like the 67 win. Genuinely all-American car, all-American drivers, really competitive race, and tremendous performance. So that was the end of the Ford program, and again, first time really a mainstream manufacturer had gone racing, and Ford set the bar pretty high. To this day, I think everyone who goes big-time auto racing tries to match the achievements of Ford. I'm going to open the floor to questions if anybody has any questions, but I did want to mention a couple of names here. First, Jim Vogel, who's the owner of the GT40, the Mark II, which is the 66 winner, and he's here, and that's his car over there in the lobby. Bill Benet, who I pointed out before, who was here in 66, and also Calvin Lane, who was here somewhere, I didn't see him, but he was there at Le Mans 64, saw the cars run. So if you guys get a chance, you should chat with them a little later today. Anybody has any questions, just lay them on me and I'll do my best.
Where is the Mark IV?
The Mark IV, it's very interesting because Ford didn't understand, I think, what they were doing, and they had no interest in their history. The actual 66 winner ended up being sold, but the Mark IV they knew was a big deal, and they kept that. It's in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn to this day. It's never run since 67. And actually, there was some damage in transport a couple of years ago, and it was sent to All-American Racers, and Dan Gurney's team actually did the restoration of the car.
The minor point about honeycomb that you referred to.
Yes.
I worked in the pieces division of 3M in 1961. And at that time, I was led to understand that that was a well-established aero technology at that time. We were making the pieces.
Oh, really?
But we were making the pieces. That's how I came across it. But that was a well-established technology, and there were lots of planes in the air using that honeycomb technology in 61, as I understood.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that the Bond failed. But I think this is interesting because this is the era when, again, where aerospace technology is making its way over to motorsports for the first time. Now we take all that stuff for granted. This is when it was really starting to happen.
Did Foyt defer to Gurney? I mean, in terms of the car setup?
Yeah, absolutely. Foyt explicitly said, whatever you want to do is fine with me. And I have to confess that Foyt's one of the only people that I was never able to talk to. I've actually tried to talk to, I did a book on the Scarab, as Don mentioned a couple of years ago, and he wouldn't talk to me about that book either. I don't know, and I don't know why. I've talked to him about other subjects. The road racing stuff he never would talk about. I have no idea why. But yeah, I mean, he clearly understood he was the junior partner in that team, but I just wanted to disabuse people of the idea that Foyt was some neophyte out there. I mean, he was probably the greatest driver in America at the time. He had just won Indy like 2 weeks previously. He had actually raced the Scarabs pretty successfully, the rear-engine Scarabs in '64. So his problem was he'd never been to Le Mans before, never raced at night before, and he didn't get any practice time because the windshields, which were made nearby in Corning, kept breaking during practice. So that was one of the problems they had that year.
Question regarding the rivalry between Ford and Ferrari. I've heard it kicked around that there was a point in time that Ferrari either attempted to or canceled a race that was supposed to occur in Italy in an effort to avoid being embarrassed by Ford. Is there any truth to that?
I believe that's how they prevented the Cobra Daytona Coupe from winning the GT championship in '64. And I don't remember the details, but yeah, it was like some chicanery that Enzo cooked up to make sure that they kept the championship. The 250 GTO, I think, won the championship, and it was long in the tooth by that point. But nothing like that happened in Le Mans stuff, but there's only because Ferrari couldn't come up with any solutions, I guess. He would have done it if he could have.
What did Henry Ford's Italian wife say about all this? Second question, how long were these GT40s run on the circuit? I remember one came in the fifth in my mind. Was it a race in Mexico and the mechanic, Dan Gurney, was underneath the car? There was a big fire.
Oh, really?
Was that a habitual problem with these things catching on fire?
I don't think so. First, yeah, Henry's Italian wife, very glamorous. Supposedly, she placed a bet on Ferrari in '67, I think, or '66, but I don't know how well that didn't go over too well, apparently, with the Ford guys. I'm not sure how long the GT40s were raced for. I mean, it was a long time. Again, you might want to look, the Ronnie Spain book is really well done, and there's several other books that sort of deal with the privateer years. I don't recall having any habitual, systemic problems with fires in those cars, so maybe that was just a bad deal there in Mexico City.
Part of that is the safety regulations change over time. So by 70, you've got to have certain types of protections in the fuel tank, that type of thing. The other issues that really by 70, 71, they were tentative, safety-wise, becoming obsolete, or the upgrades were just not worth it. You go out and buy another car, because by then, they were just old racing cars.
I'm happy to answer more questions, though. We go over there if you want to ask me anything informally, but if not, I really appreciate you taking this time. It was a pleasure for me to do this. Thanks, Don.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, gummy bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.